So I've seen it, absorbed it, and sucked its blood. But was it Nosferatu or Yesferatu? Welcome to By Candlelight, beaming goth, darkwave and post-punk straight into your brain. It will cost you some effort, a little sweat, and perhaps a little blood. Not quite sure what accent that was. Okay, so if I could distill my expectations of this Robert Eggers version of Nosferatu into a sentence, it would be something like, amazing, the definitive version, but the other two are still classics. That's what I was expecting to think, but there's lots to unpack here. So the best way of tackling this review, I think, is to first talk about the elements I loved, and then the elements that I didn't love. And at the end, I will reveal what I think is the definitive version of this film. And just to point out now that there will be spoilers around these here parts. Also, I am aware that this film has split opinion. Some people love it, other people not so much. And that's all fine, because no one's opinion is the right one, apart from mine. I'm always right. Obviously, I'm joking. First though, we need to delve into what Nosferatu actually is. Even if you know already, I think it's important to remind ourselves for the purposes of this review. So, Nosferatu is, quite literally, an unauthorised version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. To the extent that lawsuits were actually filed by Bram Stoker's widow, despite changes being made to the script. Additionally, there was a court order stating that all copies of the original 1922 film should be destroyed. However, some prints of the film survived, and that's the version that you can watch today. It's incredible to think that the original F.W. Murnau version is a classic of horror, despite it being an unauthorised version of an established story. It may be rooted in the silent era of film, but that 1922 original still stands up today as an alarming and iconic piece of German expressionist filmmaking, particularly that image of Count Orlok himself. That bald white head with those two front fangs is just as synonymous with Count Dracula as any authorised version of the text is. The film was remade in 1979 by Werner Herzog, but it still retained that iconic look of Count Orlok. And bringing spoken dialogue to the film was refreshing, and it gave us a glimpse as to what Count Orlok might actually sound like. Then leap ahead some 45 years and we now have this Robert Eggers remake. But is it the go-to version? Let's start with what I loved about it. To begin with, the film looks amazing in every sense. From the streets of the fictional German town to Orlok's castle in the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania, this film is just breathtaking. You can practically smell the pipe smoke and the embers of the fires in some of the scenes. There is also additional cinematic artistry, such as the large silhouette of Orlok's hand as it travels over the houses and streets. Honestly, this shows you the geography of Nosferatu in a way that the others were incapable of doing. For its aesthetics alone, this film is well worth a look, and sweeping you from scene to scene is Robin Carolan's amazing score, and this stands as my second point of love for this film. This music punctuates each scene, whether it be highlighting the dread or just the emotions felt by Ellen as Thomas leaves for Transylvania. The marriage of the visuals and the music was so meticulously executed that it was referred to as almost telepathic by the composer. Next is the acting. You can't fault Bill's transformative skills when it comes to playing monsters. You just can't. He is the go-to person. He is unrecognisable as Orlok, and apparently had voice lessons from an opera singer in order to lower the register of his voice. The supporting cast are great too, particularly Lily Rose Depp, who has to portray not only a range of emotions, but some quite alarming body contortions. More about that later. Nicholas Hoult, Willem Dafoe and Ralph Ineson are also fairly solid and reliable, but you really feel that this is the Ellen and Orlok show, and it's those two performances that stick in your mind. Going back to that earlier comment about Ellen's body contortions, this is actually a really clever filmic choice. To have Ellen become almost possessed by Orlok and display these convulsions, levitations and contortions, it really brought modern horror sensibilities to such an old story. Another more modern approach to horror adopted by this film is the holding off of the showing of Orlok. This is unlike the other two versions that show him pretty early on in the film, but modern filmmaking now knows that to truly terrify an audience, you need to hold back on showing the spirit, monster or entity for as long as possible. This both pulls at the audience's imagination and the fear of the unknown. Bill's version of Orlok also utters these animalistic growls that just adds to the anticipation of what this malevolent being might actually look like. However, the choice to do this in this version of Nosferatu, for me, has its downside. More on that later. So those are the elements that I loved. Let's look at what I didn't love about it. And firstly, its length. I have no problem with long films, but this film wasn't actually that long at 2 hours 20, but it felt like an hour longer than it actually was. An extended version is planned for the physical release. We don't need an extended version. So even all those elements that I loved about the film, for me, didn't stop it from dragging on. But I'm wondering whether it's to do with my final point. There's an elephant in the room, and that elephant is Count Orlok's appearance. So as I mentioned earlier, the classic iconic look of Orlok is that grotesque, white, bald-headed creature with the fangs, totally devoid of grace and handsome appeal. Here we get this moustached being that, although quite striking, is missing a huge element of horror and a massive element of the character. It's only after watching the film that you realise that images such as this must have been fan-made. But I don't think anyone would have complained if this was the Orlok we really got. After all, it states that this is based on the original 1922 film. It's this visual element of Orlok that I disliked the most. You had the hiding away of his appearance, you had those animalistic growls, all this created this anticipation. Then when you finally see him as an audience member, you need the visual to at least match the expectation. For me, it just didn't deliver on this. I feel that if Robert Eggers had any doubts about continuing that look of the classic image of Orlok, then just change it up, but still make it more grotesque and hideous than a moustached man. Because that's what distinguishes Nosferatu from the more faithful versions of Dracula. I don't know whether Robert was basing his version of Orlok on images of, say, Vlad the Impaler, but he looked more like a beetle. Not that beetle, I mean this beetle. Imagine going to see the next Scream film and Ghostface had a moustache. This is such a big deal for this film. It's like having everything perfectly in place and then at the final hurdle you take a tumble. And this is a huge hurdle, nay, the hugest of hurdles. I can feel a what were they thinking marching decisively towards this review, but it does raise a bigger question. That if you've gone off-piste to begin with in an attempt to avoid any legal issues, then does that not mean that it's open season in terms of any interpretation of Dracula? I think I will leave that just to sit there in its rhetorical cave. If I was to score it I would give it a 7. I nearly gave it a 6, but I had to have a word with myself. So, which version of Nosferatu is the best? The definitive version? For me, it's that 1922 original. That version was striking and terrifying. It still is. Although it displayed Orlok in all his glory very early on in the film, the appearance of him more than made up for that. The fact that it was a silent film meant that all of the actors needed to fully commit and convey the story via their acting. The 1979 version, although widening the visual aesthetic, contained some really hokey acting. Bar Klaus Kinski's Orlok, who just outacted everyone on that screen. Even though he looked a little bit like Gary Newman, once you see it, there's no going back. It also contained that style of filmmaking that you often see in the 70s and early 80s, which is when some evil pursues its victim and not a word is said. No cry, no dialogue, nothing. Awkward. Maybe it's because it's not accompanied by a musical leitmotif to reinforce the inner horror of the victim. Back to the silent original, there's something quite special about watching a film that was made just 25 years after the original novel was published. You feel like you're watching an artifact that better reflects the era and worldview of its original author. There's still much to like about the Robert Eggers remake, but for me, it's for more secondary reasons. I'll still be picking up a physical copy of it when it's released, not just because I'm an Eggers fan, but I'd like to see if there's a documentary contained on the special features that highlights the reasoning behind the visuals of Orlok. But yes, it will always be the 1922 original that will sit squarely above all others in my cold and wilting heart. What did you think of the new Nosferatu? And have you seen all three? If so, which one was your favourite? Let me know in the usual place. Until next time, see you later.